So, part 4. Shadows at the door. The Rampant Horse was buzzing on Friday evening, a thick haze of laughter, chatter, and the occasional out-of-tune burst of karaoke filling the air. Sandra was weaving her way between tables, expertly balancing a tray of drinks, despite the occasional cheeky comment from lecherous Lee at the bar. Dave and Vinny were engaged in a heated debate about whether a full English breakfast could cure a hangover. "Of course it does," Vinny declared, gesturing with his pint for emphasis. "Grease lines the stomach. It's science. Everyone knows that." Dave snorted. "It's not science, you pillock. It's desperation. What you need is rehydration." "Rehydration? What are you, a doctor now?" "I don't need to be a doctor to know that you're full of it." Ken listened to their exchange whilst polishing glasses, allowed himself a smile. The two of them had a knack for turning the most mundane topics into epic sagas. Their banter was part of what made the Rampant Horse feel alive. Even as he enjoyed their antics, a part of him remained on edge. The stranger from earlier in the week hadn't returned, but his presence still loomed in Ken's mind like an uninvited guest. Ken had caught himself glancing at the door more often than usual, half expecting to see that black overcoat and sharp gaze appear in the doorway. He hated how easily the past had slipped into his present, disrupting the careful balance he had worked so hard to maintain. "You all right, Ken?" Dave's voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. Ken blinked, realising he'd been staring at the same glass for far too long. "Fine," he said gruffly. "Just a long day." Vinny leaned on the bar, his expression playful, but tinged with curiosity. "You sure? You've been quieter than usual this week. Not like you to miss an opportunity to tell me off." Ken gave him a pointed look. "I'm pacing myself. Wouldn't want you getting too comfortable." Dave chuckled, but his eyes lingered on Ken a moment longer, as though he wasn't entirely convinced. Later that night, after the last stragglers had shuffled out and Sandra had finished wiping down the tables, Ken locked the doors and sank into one of the worn leather armchairs by the fireplace. The pub was quiet now, the hum of the day replaced by the soft crackle of the fire. It was his favourite time, when the place felt like it was truly his, a sanctuary carved out of the chaos of the estate. But tonight the peace had felt fragile. Ken stared into the flames, his mind drifting back to Leeds. It had been nearly 10 years since he'd left. And while the move had been his salvation, it hadn't come without a cost. He walked away from everything, a career, reputation, a life he'd spent decades building, and all because of a mistake he hadn't been able to undo. The man in the black overcoat had stirred memories Ken had tried to bury. He wasn't certain the stranger was connected to his past, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. Leeds wasn't far, and news travelled quickly in Yorkshire, especially in certain circles. Ken had always known there was a risk someone might recognise him, but he'd hoped the estate's reputation for insularity would keep him hidden. A soft whine broke his train of thought. Scraps had wandered over from Vinny's usual corner, and now sitting at Ken's feet, his head tilted, in that way dogs do when they sense something isn't right. Ken reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "What do you think here, Scraps? Am I making something out of nothing?" Scraps wagged his tail, his faith in the world, and Ken as a supplier of affection and treats, unshaken. The weekend passed without incident. By Monday, Ken had almost convinced himself that he'd been overthinking the situation. The pub was back to its usual rhythm, the steady flow of regulars, and the comforting hum of their conversations, providing a sense of normality. But on Tuesday afternoon, as Ken was unpacking a delivery of barrels in the cellar, he heard Sandra's voice calling down the stairs. "Ken, there's someone here asking for you." The tone of her voice made him pause. It wasn't the usual light-hearted sing-song she used when teasing him about his grumpiness. It was cold, cautious, uneasy even. Ken climbed the stairs, his heart thudding heavily in his chest. When he emerged into the main room, he saw the man in the black coat standing by the bar. Ken squared his shoulders, his expression carefully neutral. "Back again, are we?" The man nodded, his thin smile just as unreadable as it had been the first time. "Thought I'd give your lager another try." Ken stepped behind the bar, his movements deliberately and unhurried as he pulled a pint. He set the glass down with a quiet thud, meeting the man's gaze head on. "Anything else?" The man shook his head, taking a sip of lager. "Still good," he remarked, though his tone suggested the quality of the drink was the least of his concerns. Ken leaned on the bar, his voice low. "What do you want?" The man's smile widened slightly, although it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a drink, Ken. Can't a man enjoy a quiet pint without being interrogated?" Ken's jaw tightened. He didn't like games, and he certainly didn't like being on the back foot in his own pub. But before he could press further, the door swung open and Dave and Vinny walked in, their laughter cutting through the tension like a blade. The stranger glanced at them, his expression flickering with something Ken couldn't quite place. Amusement, perhaps. Maybe recognition. Dave gave the man a friendly nod as he approached the bar. "Afternoon. New regular, are you now?" The man chuckled, lifting his pint. "Could be." Vinny, ever curious, squinted at the stranger as though trying to place him. "You've got one of those faces," he said after a moment. "Feel like I've seen you somewhere before." Ken shot Vinny a sharp look, but the stranger just laughed, setting his glass down. "Maybe. It's a small world, isn't it?" He finished his drink, nodded to Ken, and left without another word, the door swinging shut behind him. Vinny turned to Ken, his curiosity bubbling over. "All right, you've got to tell us. Who is he?" Ken wiped down the bar, his expression giving nothing away. "Just a bloke passing through, like you said." Dave frowned. "He seems off. You sure he's not trouble?" Ken hesitated, the weight of the question settling heavily in the air. Finally looked up, his gaze steady. "If he is," Ken said quietly, "I'll handle it." And though his words were meant to reassure, they only deepened the sense of unease hanging over the rampant horse. And that is part 4. Tomorrow's the conclusion, where we find out all about the stranger